The only sounds in the living room were the distant cinematic rumble of artillery from the television and the quiet, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It was the same clock that had measured out my childhood in steady, unforgiving seconds. Tonight it felt like it was counting down to something, but I had no idea what. I was 25 years old, sitting on a couch I'd known my whole life in a house that hadn't been my home for 7 years. Across from me, sunk into his worn brown leather recliner, was my father, Richard Moore. He was 55, and the dim light from the screen carved new lines into his familiar face. We were watching a war drama. It was his choice, of course. Everything in this house, his undisputed domain, was his choice. From the thermostat setting to the brand of coffee in the kitchen, this was Richard Moore's world. I was just a visitor, a guest satellite pulled back into orbit for a holiday weekend. The movie was good, I guess, gritty, realistic. But it was the theme bubbling just under the surface of all the explosions and strategy meetings that had my stomach in a tight, familiar knot. It was a story about a father and a son, a familiar tension. A low-grade hum of anxiety I'd learned to live with started to build in my chest. It was a ghost, feeling a phantom limb of teenage insecurity. My eyes were on the screen, but my mind was drifting back in time, back to the years I now call the period of mockery. It spanned from when I was 14 to 18, a brutal 4-year tour of duty in the war of my own adolescence. During that time, a movie like this would have been a minefield. My father, then in his mid-40s, saw emotional expression as a weakness, a fatal flaw in the masculine design. And I, a sensitive kid trying to figure out the world, was a walking, talking design flaw. I remember one night, I must have been 14. We were watching some fantasy movie, a big epic with a noble king who sacrifices himself at the end. I remember the swell of the music, the slow-motion shot of the queen crying out. And I felt that lump rise in my throat. My eyes welled up. I wasn't sobbing, just moved. I tried to hide it, ducking my head and pretending to scratch my nose, hoping he wouldn't notice. But my father noticed everything. He had a sixth sense for what he considered weakness. He let the credits start to roll before he spoke. He didn't even look at me. He just clicked off the TV with a sharp snap of the remote, plunging the room into semi-darkness. Then he sighed, a heavy, disappointed sound that felt like a physical weight on my shoulders. "You crying, Thomas?" He asked, his voice flat, devoid of any real curiosity. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. I mumbled something of denial. "No, just, my eyes are watering." He finally turned to look at me, and his face held that signature expression of weary condescension. It's a movie. They're actors getting paid to pretend. Nothing to get worked up about. You've got to learn to be tougher than that. The world doesn't have time for waterworks. He got up from his chair and clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be reassuring, but felt more like a correction, like he was trying to physically knock the softness out of me. "Toughen up, son." That became his mantra. Toughen up. Swallow it. Be a man. It was the soundtrack to my teenage years. Every scraped knee, every lost baseball game, every ounce of heartbreak was met not with comfort, but with a lecture on the importance of stoicism. He wasn't just teaching me to hide my feelings, he was teaching me to be ashamed of them. He was the sole arbiter of emotional legitimacy in our house, and he had deemed my account to be permanently overdrawn. The movie on the screen now showed a young soldier reading a letter from home, his lip trembling. I instinctively braced myself, my muscles tensing for the inevitable sarcastic comment from the recliner. I could almost hear it, my father's voice, from a decade ago, dripping with scorn. "Look at this one," he would have said with a little chuckle. "Gonna be useless in a firefight if he's blubbering over some letter." But the comment never came. The only sound from his chair was the gentle creak of leather as he shifted his weight. The silence was strange, unsettling. For the past 7 years since I'd packed my bags for university at 18, our relationship had changed. It had to. The old parent-child dynamic, the drill sergeant and the disappointing recruit, couldn't survive the distance. It was replaced by a kind of polite, sterile truce. We became two adults who happened to be related. We talked on the phone. We discussed the weather, my job, his golf game, safe topics, impersonal. We never talked about the past. We never addressed the chasm between us, the one he had dug with years of casual, relentless emotional invalidation. We just built a long, rickety bridge of small talk over it and tried not to look down. I remember the day I left for school, 7 years ago. My mother was crying, hugging me tight on the front porch. My bags were in the car. It was a huge moment, the real start of my life. I was excited and terrified all at once. I hugged my mom back and I felt my own eyes getting hot. This was it. I was leaving the only home I'd ever known. I pulled away and turned to my father. He was standing there, arms crossed, with an unreadable expression. He just nodded. "All right, Thomas. Don't get soft on me out there. That university is full of crybabies. Don't become one of them." It was his parting shot, one last reminder of the rules. Even in a moment that practically demanded an emotional response, he couldn't resist the lesson. He shook my hand, a firm, brief gesture, and that was it. I got in my car and drove away, and as I watched the house shrink in my rearview mirror, I felt a strange mix of sadness and liberation. I was finally escaping his jurisdiction. I was going somewhere where I could feel things without being put on trial for it, and it worked. I grew up. I made friends who talked about their feelings. I learned that vulnerability wasn't a defect. I became, I think, a well-adjusted, financially independent adult. But every time I came back to this house, to this living room, I felt the ghost of that 14-year-old boy. I would unconsciously straighten my posture, guard my expressions, and choose my words carefully, all to avoid tripping one of my father's emotional landmines. Tonight the air was thick with all of that unspoken history. The polite distance was still there, a buffer zone between our chairs. We hadn't resolved anything in those 7 years. We'd just aged. The dynamic had shifted from a dictatorship to a quiet, cold war. We were two separate nations occupying the same small space, each with our own entrenched ideologies, bound by a treaty of blood. He was no longer in a position to openly mock me, and I was no longer in a position to be wounded by it. But the memory of the old rules hung in the air like stale smoke. On the screen, the soldier's father, a grizzled old general, appeared, reading his son's last letter home after he had fallen in action. The camera pushed in on the old man's face. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the page. He was the spitting image of my own father's ideal, hard-weathered, impenetrable. I glanced over at the recliner. My father was leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze locked on the television. He was completely still. He hadn't moved in minutes. And as I sat there in the quiet of his house watching a movie about a father and a son, I felt the familiar low-grade tension begin to change into something else, something sharp and focused and utterly new. The ticking of the clock in the hall seemed to get louder each second, stretching into an eternity. The voice of the actor playing the old general on screen was gravelly, worn down by decades of shouting orders and swallowing grief. He wasn't performing, he was just reading. The words from his son's letter were simple, almost childlike in their sincerity. They weren't about the glory of the battlefield or some grand patriotic sacrifice. They were about small things. The memory of learning to ride a bike with his father's hand steady on the seat. The smell of sawdust in the garage workshop. The one time he'd crashed the family car and his father had just sighed, checked to see if he was okay, and said, "Well, it's just metal. We can fix metal." The letter was a tapestry of tiny, insignificant moments that when woven together created the entire world of a son's love for his father. And the final lines, they were the final blow. "I was always so scared of disappointing you," the letter read as the general's voice cracked for the first time. I hope I made you proud." The on-screen general fell silent. He slowly folded the letter, his movement stiff and ancient. The camera stayed on his face, refusing to look away. He didn't break down. He didn't sob. He just sat there in the ruins of his life as his unblinking eyes began to swim. My own eyes were burning. It was a good movie. It was doing its job, but I kept my focus on the screen, my posture rigid. I was a guest in this house, an ambassador from a foreign land of emotional expression, and I knew the local customs. You don't show weakness. You don't react. You absorb the blow and you carry on. That was the first and only commandment in the gospel according to Richard Moore. But then I heard it. It wasn't loud. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible sound lost beneath the movie's somber musical score. It was a hitch, a small wet catch of breath from the recliner to my left. It was the kind of sound you try to swallow before it can escape. I'd made that exact sound 1,000 times in my own life, usually in the split second before my father would turn to me and say, "Are you seriously going to cry over this toughen up, Thomas?" My entire body went rigid. Every muscle fiber screamed at me not to look. Don't engage. Don't acknowledge. It's a trap. It's a test. For 7 years, our relationship had been governed by a fragile non-aggression pact. Looking over at him now in a moment of potential weakness would be a violation of that pact. It would be an act of war. It would be like aiming a spy satellite at his most vulnerable military installation. But I couldn't stop myself. My curiosity was a physical force, a tidal wave of all the years of repressed emotion and unspoken questions. It was more powerful than my discipline. My head began to turn slowly, almost against my will. The movement felt agonizingly loud in the quiet room. It was a creak, a groan, a declaration of intent. I wasn't just turning my head. I was turning the tables on 25 years of history. My eyes landed on his profile. He was still leaning forward, a dark silhouette against the flickering blue light of the television. His jaw was set a hard line of granite. I knew better than my own reflection. His shoulders were tense. He was the image of control, the statue of the stoic patriarch he had always been. For a second, I thought I'd imagined it. Of course I had. This was my father, the man who once told me when I was 15 and crying after our dog passed away that he was just a dog and life is full of tougher things than this. Save your tears for something that matters. The man who, after I struck out to lose the biggest baseball game of my high school career, didn't console me, but simply said, "Well, maybe if you spent less time moping, you'd have hit the ball." I was about to turn away, ashamed of my foolishness, ready to retreat back to the safety of our Cold War. But then the light from the screen shifted. A bright flash from a scene change illuminated the side of his face for a split second, and I saw it. It was impossible. It defied every law of physics that governed our family universe. It was a single glistening track of moisture carving a path from the corner of his eye down through the weathered landscape of his cheek. It wasn't a flood. It wasn't a sob. It was just a tear. A solitary, traitorous drop of water that had escaped the most heavily fortified fortress I had ever known. My brain refused to process the image. It was like seeing the sun rise in the west. It was like watching a stone statue bleed. My father, Richard Moore, the 55-year-old champion of emotional austerity, the man who treated feelings like a communicable disease, was crying. The shock hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. I felt my entire perception of reality tilt on its axis. The man sitting in that chair was not the man I knew. The man I knew was an unbreachable wall. He was the source of the rules, the judge, and the jury. His primary function in my life from the age of 14 to 18 had been to mock, belittle, and legislate my emotions into non-existence. His words echoed in my head, a phantom chorus from my teenage years. "What is this, a soap opera? Stop blubbering. Men don't cry, Thomas, they act. You're too sensitive. The world is going to eat you alive if you don't grow a thicker skin." That period of mockery, those 4 years of constant emotional audits had shaped me. He was the immovable object, and I was the resistible force. I had spent my entire adolescence believing that my sensitivity was a fundamental character flaw, a genetic defect that he, through sheer force of will, had managed to avoid. His stoicism wasn't just a personality trait, it was presented as a moral victory, a sign of his superior strength. And my tears, they were a sign of my failure. And now here he was. The lawgiver was breaking his own law. The high priest of Stoicism was desecrating his own temple. And he was doing it right in front of me, the one person on earth who had been most damaged by his rigid beliefs. The tear just hung there on his cheek, catching the shifting light of the movie. It seemed to hold the weight of all the things we'd never said. It was the apology he could never voice. It was the vulnerability he could never admit. It was the shared humanity he had always denied existed between us. In that moment, the entire power dynamic of our lives didn't just shift, it shattered. The emotional hierarchy that had defined our relationship for a quarter of a century collapsed into dust. He wasn't the strong one, and I wasn't the weak one. He wasn't the teacher, and I wasn't the student. The roles of drill sergeant and disappointing recruit evaporated into the quiet, dark air of the living room. We were just two men, two equals, a father and a son watching a movie about a father and a son, and one of them was crying. The shock slowly began to recede, and in its place something else began to rise. It was a cold, clear feeling, a sense of profound, terrifying clarity. The king was off his throne. The fortress walls had been breached, and I, the boy who had been banished from the kingdom for the crime of feeling, was the only one there to witness the fall. The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was filled with possibility. The next move was mine. The entire history of our relationship hung suspended in that dark, quiet room. Decades of unspoken rules of emotional legislation, of a father teaching his son that feelings were a weakness to be conquered, and now the legislator himself was in violation. My mind raced, sifting through the years of hurt, the sarcastic comments, the dismissive waves of his hand whenever I'd been upset. A darker, younger version of myself screamed from the past, demanding justice. It wanted me to use this moment as a weapon. I could have. Oh, it would have been so easy. I could have leaned over with a smug grin and said, "What is this, a soap opera, Dad?" I could have quoted him directly, "Men don't cry, Thomas, they act." I could have twisted the knife he had spent 4 years sharpening on my own teenage heart. The perfect poetic revenge was sitting there on a silver platter, a dish served ice cold after 7 long years of waiting. I could have destroyed him with his own words, leveled his entire worldview with a single cutting remark. The temptation was immense. It felt like a gravitational pull, the universe trying to balance the scales of all those years of emotional injustice. But as I looked at him, I didn't see the tyrant from my memories. I didn't see the unbreachable fortress or the stoic lawgiver. The light from the television flickered across his face, and for the first time I saw the man behind the myth. He looked old. Not just 55, but weary. The lines around his eyes weren't just from age. They were from decades of holding things in, of maintaining the rigid posture he thought the world and his son required of him. That single tear wasn't a sign of weakness breaking through strength. It was a sign of humanity breaking through a prison. And in that moment of profound clarity, I realized what true victory looked like. It wasn't about tearing him down. It wasn't about proving him wrong or making him pay for the past. That would just be perpetuating the same cycle of pain, using his weapons against him. True victory was about ending the war. It was about creating something new in the ruins of the old broken dynamic. It was about offering a peace treaty. My choice was made. I didn't move quickly. Every action had to be deliberate, laden with meaning. I shifted my weight on the couch, a slow, conscious movement. My hand moved through the air, traveling towards the small end table that sat between our chairs. On it was a box of tissues. It was a mundane object, something you wouldn't notice 99 times out of 100. But tonight it was the most important object in the world. It was a flag of truce. It was a pardon. My fingers made contact with the cardboard box. I gripped it, and then with surgical precision, I pinched a single tissue and began to pull. The sound it made was deafening in the quiet room. It was a soft, sharp sound like a secret being whispered. It sliced through the movie's dramatic score, a tiny personal sound effect that was meant only for an audience of two. I saw his head twitch. He didn't turn to look at me, but his posture stiffened. He knew. He knew I had seen him. The air in the room became thick, heavy, charged with 25 years of unspoken tension. I could feel his shame, his embarrassment, his bracing for the impact of my words. He was waiting for the verbal blow, the "I told you so," the bitter taste of his own medicine. He was the fallen king, and I was the usurper standing over him with the crown in my hand. He was completely, utterly vulnerable, waiting for my judgment. And I held that single, flimsy piece of paper in my hand like it was a weapon and a shield all at once. I leaned forward, closing the small gap between us. I extended my hand, offering the tissue. My arm bridged the chasm that had separated us for so long. He finally turned his head, his eyes meeting mine. I saw it all there, the shock, the confusion, the fear of what was coming next. He looked at the tissue, then back at my face, searching for the trap. He was looking for the smirk, the glint of victory in my eyes, the telltale sign of a son about to cash in on a lifetime of emotional receipts. But he didn't find it. My expression was neutral. It wasn't pity, which would have been insulting. It wasn't anger, which would have been easy. It was just calm. It was understanding. And then I did it. I gave him a slow, deliberate wink. It was a tiny movement, a flicker of an eyelid, but it contained an entire library of meaning. That wink said everything I could never articulate. It said, "I see you." It said, "I remember every single time you told me not to cry." It said, "I remember how much it hurt." But then it also said something more. It said, "And it's okay." It said, "I get it now." It said, "This rule of yours, this law against feeling, consider it officially repealed, for both of us." It wasn't a wink of mockery. It was a wink of conspiracy. It was the knowing glance between two equals who have just witnessed something impossible together. It was an acknowledgement of the absurdity of the whole situation, of the decades he spent building a dam that was always inevitably going to break. It was forgiveness, an absolution, and a final closing of a very long, very painful chapter, all delivered in a single, silent gesture. His eyes widened slightly as the meaning landed. I saw the wave of comprehension wash over him. He looked at the tissue in my hand, then back at my winking eye, and the tension in his shoulders just dissolved. The defensiveness vanished. The fear was replaced by a look of profound, quiet surprise. And beneath that, something I had never ever seen on my father's face before relief. It was the look of a man who had been carrying 100-pound weight his entire life and had just been given permission to finally set it down. His hand, weathered and strong, came up and met mine. His fingers brushed against my own as he wordlessly accepted the tissue. It was not the gesture of a defeated man. It was an act of surrender, yes, but a peaceful one. By taking that tissue, he was signing the treaty. He was ceding his lifelong, undisputed ownership of what was emotionally acceptable in our family. He was acknowledging that I wasn't the sensitive one, and he wasn't the strong one. We were just two men navigating the world as best we could. He was accepting me finally as his emotional peer. He dabbed at his cheek, and the decades of Cold War between us evaporated into the warm, dim light of the living room. The unspoken tension that had been the background noise of my entire life simply ceased to exist. We both turned back to the movie. The scene had passed, but it didn't matter. The silence that fell between us now was not the strained, awkward silence of before. It was a comfortable silence, a deep, easy, companionable silence. It was the kind of quiet that only exists between two people who completely and totally understand one another. My victory wasn't loud. There were no victory speeches, no grand pronouncements. It was a quiet internal revolution. I had won not by proving my father wrong, but by creating a space where we could both be right. My revenge was not in causing him pain, but in ending it. I had used the empathy he once mocked as a weakness to heal the generational wound he had inflicted. We sat there for the rest of the movie, side by side, father and son. The old dynamic was gone, replaced by a new foundation of mutual respect. The emotional legitimacy he had hoarded for so long was now ours to share. And as the credits rolled, I knew with absolute certainty that we weren't just watching a story about a father and a son anymore. We were finally living one.